Chapter 15 of the Turmoil. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Turmoil, Volume 1 of the Growth Trilogy, by Booth Tarkington, Chapter 15. Mary was the picture of a lady flustered. She stood with one hand closing the gate behind her, and she had turned to go in the direction Bibbs was walking. There appeared to be nothing for it but that they should walk together, at least as far as the new house. But Bibbs had paused in his slow stride, and there elapsed an instant before either spoke or moved. It was no longer than that, and yet it sufficed for each to seem to say, by look and attitude, "Why, it's you!" Then they both spake at once, each hurriedly pronouncing the other's name as if about to deliver a message of importance. They came to a stop simultaneously, but Bibbs made a heroic effort, and as they began to walk on together he contrived to find his voice. I hate a frozen fish myself," he said. "I think 3 miles was too long for you to put up with one." "Good gracious!" she cried, turning to him a glowing face from which restraint and embarrassment had suddenly fled. "Mr. Sheridan, you're lovely to put it that way, but it's always the girl's place to say it's turning cooler. I ought to have been the one to show that we didn't know each other well enough not to say something. It was an imposition for me to have made you bring me home, and after I went into the house, I decided I should have walked. Besides, it wasn't 3 miles to the car line. I never thought of it." "No," said Bibbs earnestly. "I didn't either. I might have said something if I'd thought of anything. I'm talking now, though. I must remember that, and not worry about it later. I think I'm talking, though it doesn't sound intelligent even to me. I made up my mind that if I ever met you again I'd turn on my voice and keep it going, no matter what I said. She interrupted him with laughter, and Mary Vertrees's laugh was one which Bibbs's father had declared, after the house-warming, a cripple would crawl 5 miles to hear. And at the merry lilting of it Bibbs's father's son took heart to forget some of his trepidation. "I'll be any kind of idiot," he said, "if you'll laugh at me some more. It won't be difficult for me." She did, and Bibbs's cheeks showed a little actual color, which Mary perceived. It recalled to her, by contrast, her careless and irritated description of him to her mother just after she had seen him for the first time. Rather tragic and altogether impossible. It seemed to her now that she must have been blind. They had passed the new house without either of them showing, or possessing, any consciousness that had been the destination of one of them. "I'll keep on talking," Bibbs continued cheerfully, "and you keep on laughing. I'm amounting to something in the world this afternoon. I'm making a noise, and that makes you make music. Don't be bothered by my bleating out such things as that. I'm really frightened, and that makes me bleat anything. I'm frightened about 2 things. I'm afraid of what I'll think of myself later if I don't keep talking now, I mean, and I'm afraid of what I'll think of myself if I do. And besides those 2 things, I'm frightened anyhow. I don't remember talking as much as this more than once or twice in my life. I suppose it was always in me to do it, though, the first time I met anyone who didn't know me well enough not to listen." "But you're not really talking to me," said Mary. "You're just thinking aloud." "No," he returned gravely. "I'm not thinking at all. I'm only making vocal sounds because I believe it's more mannerly. I seem to be the subject of what little meaning they possess, and I'd like to change it, but I don't know how. I haven't any experience in talking, and I don't know how to manage it." "You needn't change the subject on my account, Mr. Sheridan," she said. "Not even if you really talked about yourself." She turned her face toward him as she spoke, and Bibbs caught his breath. He was pathetically amazed by the look she gave him. It was a glowing look, warmly friendly and understanding, and what almost shocked him, it was an eagerly interested look. Bibbs was not accustomed to anything like that. I'm," he stammered, and the faint color in his cheeks grew almost vivid. She was still looking at him, and she saw the strange radiance that came into his face. There was something about him, too, that explained how queer many people might think him when he did not seem queer to Mary Vertrees. He seemed the most quaintly natural person she had ever met. He waited and became coherent. "You say something now," he said. "I don't even belong in the chorus, and here I am trying to sing the funny man's solo. You—" "No," she interrupted. "I'd rather play your accompaniment." "I'll stop and listen to it, then." "Perhaps," she began. But after pausing thoughtfully, she made a gesture with her muff, indicating a large brick church which they were approaching. "Do you see that church, Mr. Sheridan?" "I suppose I could," he answered in simple truthfulness, looking at her. "But I don't want to. Once, when I was ill, the nurse told me I'd better say anything that was on my mind, and I got the habit. The other reason I don't want to see the church is that I have a feeling it's where you're going, and where I'll be sent back." She shook her head in cheery negation. "Not unless you want to be. Would you like to come with me?" Why, yes," he said. "Anywhere." And again it was apparent that he spoke in simple truthfulness. "Then come, if you care for organ music. The organist is an old friend of mine, and sometimes he plays for me. He's a dear old man. He had a degree from Bonn, and was a professor afterward, but he gave up everything for music. That's he, waiting in the doorway. He looks like Beethoven, doesn't he? I think he knows that, perhaps, and enjoys it a little. I hope so." "Yes," said Bibbs, as they reached the church steps. "I think Beethoven would like it, too. It must be pleasant to look like other people." "I haven't kept you," Mary said to the organist. "No, no," he answered heartily. "I would not mind so only you should sure come." "This is Mr. Sheridan, Dr. Kraft. He has come to listen with me." The organist looked bluntly surprised. "Is that so?" he exclaimed. "Well, I am glad if you wish him, and if he can stand my little playing. He is a musician himself, then, of course?" "No," said Bibbs, as the three entered the church together. I tried to play." Fortunately, he checked himself. He had been about to offer the information that he had failed to master the Jew's harp in his boyhood. "No, I'm not a musician," he contented himself with saying. "What?" Dr. Kraft's surprise increased. "Young man, you are fortunate. I play for Miss Vertrees. She comes always alone. You are the first. You are the first one ever." They had reached the head of the central aisle, and as the organist finished speaking, Bibbs stopped short, turning to look at Mary Vertrees in a dazed way that was not of her perceiving. For though she stopped as she did, her gaze followed the organist, who was walking away from them toward the front of the church, shaking his white Beethovenian mane roguishly. "It's false pretenses on my part," Bibbs said. "You mean to be kind to the sick, but I'm not an invalid any more. I'm so well I'm going back to work in a few days. I'd better leave before he begins to play, hadn't I?" "No," said Mary, beginning to walk forward. "Not unless you don't like great music." He followed her to a seat about halfway up the aisle while Dr. Kraft ascended to the organ. It was an enormous one, the procession of pipes ranging from long, starveling whistles to thundering fat guns. They covered all the rear wall of the church, and the organist's figure, reaching its high perch, looked like that of some Lilliputian magician ludicrously daring the attempt to control a monster certain to overwhelm him. "This afternoon some Handel!" he turned to shout. Mary nodded. "Will you like that?" she asked Bibbs. "I don't know. I never heard any except Largo. I don't know anything about music. I don't even know how to pretend I do. If I knew enough to pretend, I would." "No," said Mary, looking at him and smiling faintly. "You wouldn't." She turned away as a great sound began to swim and tremble in the air. The huge empty space of the church filled with it, and the two people listening filled with it. The universe seemed to fill and thrill with it. The two sat intensely still, the great sound all round about them, while the church grew dusky, and only the organist's lamp made a tiny star of light. His white head moved from side to side beneath it rhythmically, or lunged and recovered with the fierceness of a duelist thrusting, but he was magnificently the master of his giant, and it sang to his magic as he bade it. Bibbs was swept away upon that mighty singing. Such a thing was wholly unknown to him. There had been no music in his meager life. Unlike the tale, it was the Princess Bedrulbudour who had brought him to the enchanted cave, and that, for Bibbs, was what made its magic dazing. It seemed to him a long, long time since he had been walking home drearily from Dr. Gurney's office. It seemed to him that he had set out upon a happy journey since then, and that he had reached another planet, where Mary Vertrees and he sat alone together, listening to a vast choiring of invisible soldiers and holy angels. There were armies of voices about them, singing praise and thanksgiving, and yet they were alone. It was incredible that the walls of a church were not the boundaries of the universe, to remain so forever. Incredible that there was a smoky street just yonder, where housemaids were bringing in evening papers from front steps, and where children were taking their last spins on roller skates before being haled indoors for dinner. He had a curious sense of communication with his new friend. He knew it could not be so, and yet he felt as if all the time he spoke to her, saying, "You hear this strain? You hear that strain? You know the dream that these sounds bring to me?" And it seemed to him as though she answered continually, I hear that strain, and I hear the new one that you are hearing now. I know the dream that these sounds bring to you. Yes, yes, I hear it all. We hear together." And though the church grew so dim that all was mysterious shadow, except the vague planes of the windows and the organist's light with the white head moving beneath it, Bibbs had no consciousness that the girl sitting beside him had grown shadowy. He seemed to see her as plainly as ever in the darkness, though he did not look at her. And all the mighty chanting of the organ's multitudinous voices that afternoon seemed to Bibbs to be chorusing of her and interpreting her, singing her thoughts, and singing for him the world of humble gratitude that was in his heart because she was so kind to him. It all meant Mary. End of chapter 15.